This is the fourth and final lecture for week 3, talking about socialization and social context. And this lecture looks at different methods of socialization. So these are the 6 methods of socialization that are described in your reading, and each one will be defined in this lecture, and I'll give some examples as well in terms of how these methods might function and the techniques that are associated with these different methods. Here's that table again to sort of link everything. So in the first lecture, we looked at the outcomes of socialization, outcomes including things like understanding gender roles and gaining certain types of values, developing morals, forming one's self-esteem. And those outcomes come from interactions with important socialization agents like the family, like peers, like the community, like mass media. And it happens through methods. And so that's what this piece will look at. This lecture will look at defining these different methods of socialization that are listed here: the affective method, operant method, observational, cognitive, sociocultural, and apprenticeship methods. So that we'll go now to look at what we mean by methods of socialization and define each of those methods. So socialization, which is learning about the ways of living in a particular society or within a particular group, are transmitted through a number of different methods that we're going to look at now in this lecture. And I want to reiterate a couple of points from the second lecture for this week. Socialization can be intentional or unintentional. So you might think you've learned something, you've had an outcome of socialization, you may have developed a particular value, but it may or may not have been the case that the agent of socialization was intending for you to develop that value. A lot of these things may be kind of unconscious. They're things that people are doing without being aware that they're that they're encouraging an individual to develop a particular outcome. So it's not that these methods are always someone is thinking, I'm socializing this child to do X. This may be completely unintentional, but nevertheless, people are all the time using these methods that we'll look at. Or they could be intentional. So more intentional socialization often comes from schools, which are very clear about what outcomes they're seeking in children, for example, or an employer, which is very clear about what the employer wants in a particular individual. So it can be either one, intentional or unintentional. And the process of socialization, I want to say again, the individual is not passive in that. So socialization is reciprocal, so there's a behavior that's being directed towards the individual, but the individual, the way they are in terms of their temperament and their physical appearance and all those kinds of things, they influence how they're treated by a socialization agent. So it's a dynamic process. It's not a passive process where someone's just receiving. People are part of the interactions that they have. So now we'll talk about the different methods and give definitions of those. The first method of socialization is the affective method. And really, rather than a method, it's more like the foundation to all the other methods of socialization. And the affective method, the way that an effect in terms of how someone is socialized operates is due to the feeling that is there between the socialization agent and the person being socialized. It's about the connection that's there. So in week 4, we'll talk about attachment and relationships, and it's when people have a close connection, an attachment or close feeling of connection, that makes the other forms of socialization powerful. So it's what underlies the other ones that will come. When there are sources of socialization from people that an individual cares about, they're more powerful than a source that an individual does not care about. So the most powerful sources of socialization are parents, and then also, particularly in adolescence, peers, when there's a strong attachment to peers. And then later, if there's a strong feeling of connection to people, like employers, etc., they're going to be stronger than where there's no emotional connection. And there can be an emotional connection to the media. So there can be a form of an attachment, a kind of a feeling of connection that creates a powerful desire to imitate, for example. So again, the affective method kind of underlies the other methods because it's about feeling some kind of connection with the agent of socialization. The operant method of socialization is when an outcome is produced because of what happens after an action. So this is a method of socialization related to things like punishment and reward. So there's several techniques that are associated with the operant method of socialization, but the key idea here is that after a behavior, what happens directly after that behavior? And what happens after that behavior is going to encourage that behavior to happen again or discourage that behavior from happening again. So reinforcement encourages the behavior to happen again. So if there's positive reinforcement, then there's some kind of a positive thing that happens for the individual. They exhibit a behavior, like a reward, for example. And negative reinforcement is the termination of an unpleasant condition. So negative reinforcement still is reinforcing the behavior. It could be something like, if you're in a car and your car is buzzing at you until you put your seatbelt on, and then you put your seatbelt on, and the sound stops. That was a negative reinforcement to get you to wear your seatbelt. Your car was trying to train you to wear your seatbelt. So that's an example of reinforcement where there's something that happens after a behavior to encourage that behavior to happen again. Now, extinction and punishment are intended to discourage a behavior from happening again. So this is where there's a behavior, and after the behavior occurs, there's some form of punishment. So taking away privileges or whatever is going to be powerful for the individual. So shaming can be a kind of a punishment, but there's something that happens that's unpleasant after the behavior that's intended to discourage the behavior from happening again. Extinction is where a behavior is ignored. So that also is meant to discourage the behavior by ignoring the behavior. So this is where, when a child misbehaves and you pay attention to the child, sometimes you're reinforcing the behavior unintentionally by giving some kind of reinforcement, some kind of attention. But extinction is, let's say a child is misbehaving in public, ignoring that child, wanting them to stop their behavior by not giving it attention. So extinction is intended to be to no response, the ignoring response. Other forms of operant socialization are things like feedback. So that's something you get as a student, for example. You're being socialized, let's say, to be a better writer by getting feedback and therefore learning, how did I do on this? Do I improve? Am I meeting the norm? Am I meeting the standard that I meant to meet? So feedback is a way. You have an action, let's say that you've submitted an assessment, then you get feedback, you learn how, you get assessed according to a norm on that behavior, and then that encourages, some kind of change to that behavior or encourage that behavior to happen again. And then learning by doing is another example, operant socialization. So this is where socialization occurs through experience and through interaction. So when you're learning by actually trying something, that's a way of learning by doing, learn the operant method. So testing something out. You're learning how to fish. You're learning how to fish by casting your line, and you keep trying it over and over again. So there's some kind of behavior, and you're learning, did it work? Did I get a fish? And then change that behavior over time. So all these techniques are associated with there's a behavior, and is that behavior sort of something that follows a behavior to make it happen again or to change the behavior for the future. The observational method of socialization is a powerful method where the effect in terms of how someone develops an outcome comes from imitating the agent of socialization. The technique is modeling. So the agent of socialization is modeling something, and then the person who's being socialized is imitating in some way. So this photo here is, it looks like there are two children, and maybe the boy knows how to use chopsticks from the sister. So he's imitating, he's got chopsticks in his fingers, so you can see, that's a way of learning how to do that particular skill, which would be a developmental skill. How do I do it? I'm watching someone else. Children might be, toilet trained by watching, an older sibling go use the toilet. There's so many things that we learn through imitation. You learn by watching people in the media. What does it mean to be a certain way? We pick up a lot in terms of others and imitating, either very overtly in terms of a behavior or even subtly. I learn how to imitate in terms of how you present yourself and how you dress and things that may affect your identity by picking up on sort of using this method of the observational method of observing a model and learning by observing. The cognitive method of socialization, the outcome of socialization is produced by a method of information processing. So this is around sort of processing something through the mind to understand what is expected. So the different techniques that are used include things like instruction. So an instruction would be, telling someone directly what you expect from them. So bring me your shoes, to a young child, or, come back at this time. You've got a curfew at this time for an adolescent. Clean your room. So can be a direct instruction in terms of these are the norms for your behavior. A child in this household is meant to have a clean room. Okay, in the school, instruction, turn your homework in on time. A student in this classroom is meant to turn their homework in on time. An employee, get your reports in by this time. So a lot of socialization can come that way, with being told directly what is expected of you. Another is by setting a standard and expecting people to perform to a standard. So that happens, for example, in school. You're told, here's the criteria against which you'll be assessed. This is the standard for getting this kind of grade in this. Or sometimes you also know what the standard is in terms of social behaviors, like from peers. So what does it mean to be the cool kid? It means to dress like that. It means to act like that. So that's the standard I need to meet if I'm going to be that kind of person. And then reasoning is another method, another technique associated with the method of cognitive method of socialization. So this is where, for example, a parent would have a conversation with a child, don't X because of X. So, chew with your mouth closed because it's rude if you don't do that, or put your seatbelt on because it's dangerous if you don't. So it's getting a person to think through the consequences and understand the reasons why they would have a certain type of behavior. So the method again is by getting you to think through instructions, getting you to think through the standards for behavior, or getting you to think through the reasons for having a certain kind of behavior. That's the method. The apprenticeship method of socialization, the effect here emerges from guided participation. So this is where you're learning something and you're getting some support. And there's a process here around structuring. So if you're learning something like how to tie shoes, there might be some kind of structuring first where a child is given instruction. Here's your shoe. Now you put your shoe on. And then collaborating. Okay, I'm going to help you tie your shoe, and we'll tie it together. And then transferring the task to the person. Okay, now you show me how you tie your shoe. So there's the apprentice here, is the person being socialized. The agent of socialization is helping them learn particularly skills. And so it can be used for something that's like a physical task, like learning to tie your shoe, or it can be used to develop kind of more advanced skill. So you get some training to do something within the workplace. You're learning how to operate a bandsaw. You're not going to be left to do that by yourself the first time. Someone who's more experienced will show you how it works, will collaborate with you, and then when you are meeting the standard, it's transferred to you. Another example is learning to drive. So, at first you're instructed on what's involved in terms of driving, and then you're going to doing some very basic driving in a parking lot, and then collaborating. You take the wheel certain times, and the person who's helping you at other times, and then transferring, where you get a time when you get to practice those skills on your own, and you've got your P plate. So a lot of particularly developing skills will come through this apprenticeship method. And so the final method of socialization is the sociocultural method of socialization. And the effect in terms of the outcome, how it's achieved, is through conforming. So conforming to some kind of a group or some kind of a culture or subculture. So one technique is through group pressure. So you can think about, for adolescents, for example, when peers are so powerful in their lives and that particular agent of socialization is most influential, peer pressure can be a very strong method of socialization technique to get people to act in certain ways, to conform to certain kinds of behaviors. Traditions are another type of technique associated with the sociocultural method. So traditions can be how people act when they belong to a certain group. It could be related to, for example, gender norms. In our tradition, in our culture, this is how women behave, this is how men behave. So that's a way of socializing around gender norms, gender roles. Rituals and routines can be another way people are socialized. For example, when you're part of a religion, to engage in certain kinds of rituals or routines, like having a certain day set aside for religious observance or a certain day of the year, and how you act during that time and the kinds of beliefs that you adhere to and the ways you behave. And then symbols are another way that can influence the way people behave. So the way people are towards the flag, for example, can be, a sign. They show great respect, and that symbol is really it's standing for something else in the culture. It's representing, how people feel about their country, for example. So again, this method of socialization, the sociocultural method, is about conforming to some kind of expectations for a group or a subculture or a culture. So that's our lecture on socialization and social context. So again, the idea is that an individual comes with their nature, that piece around their biology and their temperament and their appearance and their age, and their gender. They experience different socialization methods, like the affective method that underlies the others, the connections that they have to others. They might experience the operant method and get punished for certain kind of behavior or rewarded for another. The observational method, learning by seeing what other people do. The cognitive method, learning through getting some kind of message that has to be cognitively processed, like instructions or standards. The sociocultural method, that's around conforming to group expectations, and the apprenticeship method, which is learning skills by getting some kind of scaffolding. And those methods are used by powerful agents of socialization where there's some kind of a connection, like the family, like media, like schools and peers. And then that results in outcomes of socialization like understanding what it means to be part of certain gender roles, what's expected of males or females in a society, to learn self-regulation of your behaviors. You can't just do what you want all the time, or you can't just let your temper go. You have to control yourself. Learning certain values. This is what it is to belong to this group. And then learning morals. This is what's right from wrong. So all of these pieces come together to produce those kinds of outcomes. So those are our lectures for week 3. Thanks.